So, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Porsche Conversations. This evening's talk, I'm really excited and happy to introduce Rupali Gupte, who's been a friend and co-conspirator for quite a while. Rupali is a graduate of the KRVI school in Bombay and got her master's from Cornell University. She's a co-founder and an associate professor at the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai. She is also the founder of the Collective Research Initiative. The Collective Research Initiatives Trust and the Bard Studio. Her research, writing, and work in the urban sphere is walks this very interesting line between architectural fiction and deep research. She has also used the exhibition as a form of exploring these themes. She has written and exhibited in Italy, in New York, as part of the Jugaad exhibition, the Jugaad urbanism exhibition there, as well as in other places in South America and elsewhere. Her work that centers itself on transactional objects is of particular interest to us here. She talks about how urban practices, agency, and social relationships shape cities. My particular interest is that she privileges and looks at the scale of operations that are smaller and more engaged than that of a building, than the category of building, and which empowers a much larger set of communities in the making of cities. Thank you, Rupali, for joining us here at Porsche Conversations. Please, welcome.
Thanks, Riaz, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. What I'll do is I'm going to share my screen now, but just to kind of preface a little bit what I'm going to present here. This is part of a research that, kind of a larger research practice that we've been involved in. And also the practice itself takes many forms, So in the sense that it takes the form of writing and of course teaching, but also kind of it sort of straddles between art, architecture, and urban research. And we find that form very productive because new questions can be asked through that form. So that's kind of where we come from. And what I'm going to present to you is basically three concepts, okay? Three concepts or three terms through which we have come about to look at the idea of the city. So I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah. You can see my screen, right, Riaz?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, it's in this, the idea of the ever-changing city is what is sort of placed there, and Professor Chaya sort of also kind of spoke about that title, and I kind of like that. But I'm also kind of nuancing it further by calling it Trips, Kicks, and the City Lived. And these are basically talking about three concepts, like I just said, through which we've come about understanding the city, because in some ways the way cities have been understood have been through either the kind of instrumental lens or then a kind of lens of criticism, in which case there are often binaries through which we look at cities, and where we often miss some of the nuances through which cities kind of get lived, and as Riaz says, agencies through which people occupy space and occupy cities. So that's where this is coming from. And I'm going to walk you through those three concepts through which we look at the idea of cities. So the first one, as Riaz just mentioned, the idea of transactional capacities. And let me tell you a little bit what this term means, what transactional capacities means. And so if you look at this is the development plan of Mumbai. And we see that typically a plan is made of series of lines, right? There are lines which are 2 lines for streets, a line for the plot, a line for the building. And so that's the way you kind of, look at the idea of the city through these singular lines. But the contention here is that if you look closer and if you go to the ground and go onto the field, then this line is really not a single line, but it's a thick line. It's a corroded line. And in that corrosion, there are series of occupancies. There are series of ways in which people occupy space. So for example, this is in Grant Road in Mumbai, and you'll see that there is a chawl at the back here there. Right below there's a series of shops. But in front of the shops, if you see this space, there is, what we call the 1 foot shop, which is only a foot wide. And often the way it kind of gets established is that they pay a little bit of nominal rent to the shop behind, or there's some form of kinship relationship through which this kind of relationship is set up. And then there's, of course, the series of hawkers in the front. But then there's also sometimes another layer, which is the layer of the homeless who take care of some of these wares. Some of these hawkers also keep their goods in the shop behind, in the chawl behind, and pay a little bit of rent to some of the homeowners. And so this line otherwise typically would have been on that plan a single line, And so, but then this is really sort of, not that thick line, but all of these layers. So there's almost these kind of 5 layers through which that line can be understood. And then there's, a series of these objects, and I'll come back a little bit to the objects which we call transactional objects. So let me sort of come back to that later. So this was a commercial establishment plus a residential establishment. This is a chawl in Mumbai. It's a purely residential space. But what is interesting again in this is the porosity of that urban space, and the way the house itself, the whole idea of what a home is or what a house is. Because in some ways we look at the home as property, and you kind of start looking at it as, in the famous parlance of developers, it's, you say it's a 1 BHK house or a 2 BHK house, and somehow that becomes the default way in which we kind of start describing the idea of a home. But here we have something very, very different happening in the way the urban form is configured. And this is the Poonawalla Chawl in Parel. And if you see, the house is actually really tiny, it's a really small house. But what happens is that there's a door in the front, there's a door at the back, and then there are a series of these corridors on either sides connected by bridges. And what happens is that these are the spaces, the corridors, the bridges become the spaces in which people spill out, and in some way starts becoming the living room of the whole building. And in that sense, then the house is not just that one little house, but it's the entire sort of space which becomes one big house, and so it's the urban form that allows that it is that the configuration of the form itself, which is allowing the fact that a tiny house is now becoming a much larger space. So what is a home gets completely reconfigured, and so that's kind of the Poonawalla Chawl that faces the street. And then there are the corridors. This is the corridor at the back. This was the corridor in the front. And then these, which are the series of bridges where you find a lot of people hanging out. And particularly it's a space where the older people are kind of hanging out. People who may, not be, they may be physically challenged, kind of also find space. So in some ways it becomes, and one thing that is interesting, if you see this, the corridor, there's a lot of this, you'll find a lot of furniture hanging around, and what is interesting, we call it orphan furniture, because at some point you don't know who that furniture belongs to. It's something that has been lying around for so long that it almost starts getting used by different people, and it becomes the commons at some point, it doesn't belong to one person but belongs to everyone. And so And so this is actually, this is an old couple that has been, living in one of those tenements. And the gentleman is actually kind of ill, and he's bedridden for 3 years. But the fact is that he can do that because of the porosity of the house, because the front door and the back door are kept virtually open. And so people actually kind of walk in and out of the house. And so in the absence of social security, this urban form, provides that kind of social security where your neighbors then become, part of your house and other things. And this is really, this is a very interesting detail. If you look at, this shutter, this is a kitchen cabinet, and the shutter actually of the kitchen cabinet through the day shuts the kitchen cabinet. In the night, the same shutter goes and shuts the door outside, and closes the door outside. So it's the same detail that kind of closes it. And in some ways, the door at the back is kept open so people can just walk in, and the artist Duchamp had a similar detail. He kind of worked on this door which closes two spaces at the same time. And it's interesting that, somebody who, an everyday person, has kind of, devised a detail like that, and also shows that, it's a way in which that house can actually remain open and is designed to be kept open, so that it's only in the night when you need security, and the rest of the day you can actually keep it open. So that is, and then you'll find that the same detail is inside also, between what is the common, the multi-purpose room and the kitchen. You have the same detail. So, and then that's the kind of, the common spaces, the corridors, the bridges, all of them start acting as one living room of the entire chawl, and in that sense make the whole chawl into a home, one big home. And this is again an interesting urban form again that has come out of in Mumbai itself. And this is the Kumbharwada. This is in Dharavi. And if you see again the way the urban form works, there is an external road, and then there's a shop over there. This is the place where they make the pots, and this is the place where they also burn the pots. There's a kiln at the back. And so again, there is this kind of porosity through which this house works. And then on the top again, there are workshops or people living upstairs. And so again, this is an urban form that has evolved, over the years, that in some ways becomes, it's a house form that has evolved, which also becomes urban form. And I think that configuration is something that is important in the way we actually look at the idea of the home and the city. And this is again another urban form, this is a self-built settlement in Bandra. This is called Bairampada. And if we again look closely at the grain, it's what happens below is that this is a grocery shop. On top is a unit that does embroidery. On the top is a worker's dorm. Above is the owner, the one who's actually built all of this. Right at the back, there is a place where they rent utensils to make biryani. So these large utensils that you kind of use during Eid and other festivals, which you cannot keep at home because they're so large that they'll actually fill your entire house with. And then there's again the embroidery unit above. There's a reading library on the top, and then there's a mosque and a community space. So all of this together in one space in a self-built settlement, something that is impossible to find. This kind of intensity is otherwise impossible to find in other parts of the city. And this is really what, redevelopment of some of these spaces looks like, and this is the urban form that we are leading towards. So if we see in both cases, the one on the top is a redevelopment of one of these self-built settlements where people are moved to the city peripheries. And this is in Bombay, you have what is called the slum rehabilitation, which happens either in situ when you have, when a developer comes in and builds for the people within the slum. But when there is an infrastructure project that is supposed to come in, then people will be moved to city peripheries. And this is typically the urban form that evolves in both cases. which is, one is that the distance is 3 meters apart from each other. And you have the series of there's a central corridor and houses on both sides with very little light and ventilation to most of the floors. And some of these cases, these buildings are in Mankut. And today we've also found that some of these places have the highest rate of tuberculosis because of, not having adequate light, ventilation and other things. And the lower image is where some of the older housing in the city is again being redeveloped into these kind of towers, which again, imagine this is one, and these are where the lowest buildings are, but imagine when all of them get redeveloped, what happens. So this is actually something that, is a thesis that we kind of working with, the idea that the spaces that I showed you before, like spaces like these or spaces like these, have what I call transactional capacities. And the transactional capacities, if you sort of define them, transactional capacities are densities, they are number of activities per unit space, they are networks that people establish between themselves, they are forms of new forms of livelihood, there's the rich cultural setting, there's a form of security that comes up because, like you saw in the Poonawalla Chawl, that people are looking out for each other. And also a very, very high level of diversity is something that you find. And on the opposite axis is what we've been seeing, that, it moves towards the kind of skyscraping, apartment type. And what actually reduces as you go is both on this axis, the transactional capacity, but what also reduces is the kind of blur and the corrosion that allows all these occupancies. But of course, on the other axis, what is increasing is the resources, whereas the self-built settlements consume very little resources. The opposite axis also consumes many, many more resources in terms of infrastructure, space, energy, and also pressure on infrastructure. A lot of these buildings are coming up where roads are really, really small, and it's almost impossible to, have these buildings located in. So that's the whole idea of transactional capacities is an important thesis. And as architects, as urbanists, I think that's an interesting measure for us to kind of start evaluating urban form through this idea of transactional capacities. And within the there's a subset within the idea of transactional capacities is what we've been interested in following, this idea of transactional objects. And so, for example, this is the street vendor who locates her shop inside a compound wall. And you see that there's a little grill that has been taken away and her shop has been located within it. Or then, of course, this also as a transactional space, this kind of kitchen cabinet that becomes a door, the living room door, but also the the cabinet door, but also the main door of the house. And then series of things like this, which is a shop inside a shop, like there is the typist shop located within a lawyer's shop, and configurations like that are interesting, in the face of what we are, more and more seeing as good governance in cities, where we're looking at forms like GIS and transparencies and all of that. And what happens when you make a GIS map is that you have to have a clean polygon, and then that clean polygon attributes to one kind of, ownership. And so what happens in that is all these complex ownerships, complex occupancies, different forms of tenure get completely ironed out, because then you have to attribute it to one owner, one person who actually would kind of have that shop. But relationships like that, which actually form the DNA of the city, the grain of the city, are completely wiped out. And so a series of these, this is again a 1-foot shop, there's a shop under a staircase, the shop inside the shop, a series of ways in which people occupy city space. This is again a very interesting 1-foot shop in the inner city of Mumbai. And then of course the cupboard shop. And so we were invited, and this is what Riaz was also talking about, the idea of exhibitions, but also a form of discourse that you speak to the world through. And this was when we were invited to the Venice Biennale, and the curator of the Biennale was Okwi Enviser. the first African-American curator of the series. And before this, there were only white people who curated this. And what was interesting in the way he sort of set up the provocation was he called it of all the world's futures, And for us, we came with this idea that the future is not a kind of utopian, modernist future, which is a tabula rasa, clean slate, but it's a future where you look at what already exists in the city and take it one notch up, So these were kind of one notch up futures that we were proposing for the city. And we kind of looked at this idea of transactional objects where the 1 foot shop is sort of, rethought and reimagined, to one other sort of level. And of course, again, going back. And of course, this was the day and night 1 foot shop. So this was when the day shop closed and the shutters of the day shop closed, you would see that the night shop sort of came and located itself on the shutters of the day shop. So the series of sort of propositions that we made, it was the 1 foot shop that was then divided into the 6-inch day shop and the 6-inch night shop, or then these kind of, pokey things that came out, which became places where the night shop could sort of hang its stuff on. So series of propositions. This was a shop that touched the city at only one point, so occupied that city at a very small, at a very small point. And so we made this thing, what we call the pokey sphere, which touched the city at 3 points, but which could also be rolled away when, there was a raid. So there was the pokey sphere. And then you found these transactional objects all over the city, they kind of, they inhabited the city, they kind of, they were idiosyncratic, they were, erotic, they kind of created city space. This is a place which was at a city corner, at the node. And this is where a carpenter, the central one is the carpenter, then this one is a plumber, who kind of, these are daily wage workers who are sort of standing at the edge, advertising their services, so they would sell. And it's a shop, but it's also kind of prosthetic device that they would sort of carry around with them. And so the things that we kind of built were also companions. This was a toolbox that could go and sort of perch itself along with them at the kind of periphery. Or then there were series of people who inhabited the city who were not necessarily transacting, in terms of buying and selling, but they were, occupying city space at another transcendental level. There were people who were begging for alms, but, quasi-religious at times. So occupying city spaces in many ways. This one was an interesting one because there's this construction work that is going on the road is being constructed, but he sits on a high chair, almost oblivious of what is happening underneath him, And so there was this sort of kind of chair that we designed. It was called the astrologer's chair, where you sit up high above the city at another transcendental plane, as the city sort of goes by underneath you, So, and then series of them, this was the staircase shop, and then this was a kind of web-like space underneath the staircase that became the staircase shop. Or then these baskets that the porters in the inner city, this is the only thing that they possess. The porters who the entire day carry these baskets around and sort of help people port things from one place to the other. And then in the afternoon, they take a nap in that same basket. So what we did is we kind of made this basket bed, which was a slightly larger space, basket, which became, more comfortable to rest in the afternoons. And then you found series of these, you had people, coming together as communities around shops. And, in the evening, you would find that people kind of came together, or then at the threshold of shops or on carts. There was always the formation of a community. People sort of weren't alone, sort of it didn't exist by themselves. So there was the bench ladder, which was a ladder, a kind of painter's ladder, but also became a bench which could be inhabited, by a community in the evenings. And yeah, so series of these, these were series of provocations and series of ways in which the transactional object, this was a library, a kind of, and you saw this library space everywhere in the city, and it's kind of a library space that could be moved around telling stories of cities. Or then this idea of public caps that you could, series of these caps that are located where you could sort of go and hide from the sun And so, yeah, and then so these were a series of, that was in Venice, we kind of made these large architectural sculptures, and then made many, many more of these sort of provocations. This was the space in Venice where it was located. But it is also kind of speaking to the world, the possibility of looking at a future, that did not follow the future trajectory that, the developed world followed, but kind of trying to look at another future that came from this one step further from what already exists in cities. And that was, the kind of provocation. And the smaller objects that you saw became many, many more ways in which the provocations actually came. And this was the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism, where we set up a conversation between systems and madness. That systems make cities, but it's also madness that makes cities, the idiosyncrasies of cities that kind of make them. And this is a series of provocations that, again, from the ones that you saw, but many more. And also kind of, this is also shown in a gallery in Mumbai, the Project 88, in which case there was one more transactional space, which was this long sort of serpentine table, which could be reconfigured in many, many ways, to kind of display, but come together as a community, or, all kinds of ways in which you could sort of reconfigure the serpentine table. So that was the first term. This is the second term, and again, a very important term to again think of cities through, this idea of settling. Because often when we think of the way cities develop, there's a modernist frame through which we look at the idea of cities developing. You always think of starting anew, afresh, that somehow what already exists is already problematic, and so you sort of start with a clean slate. But here's a proposition that says that cities take a lot of time to settle, and kind of establish themselves. So the first image that you saw, this was a form of settling, that the series of layers, the relationships that get established between the chawl, the shop, the 1-foot shop, the hawkers, the homeless people, all of these relationships, settle over time. Okay. Or for example, when an infrastructure project comes in, this was a bridge, again, this is in Mumbai, it has been recently dismantled. But again, the way when the bridge was built, it was also in some ways built for efficiency, to move from one place to the other. But the way people occupy these bridges are very different. They're not necessarily occupied for just commuting. But for example, you see that there is a picnic happening on the skywalk. So these get settled and occupied in many, many different ways. Of course, there's a play, there's a match going on under the flyover. Or another form of settling, this was a slum sanitation project, a toilet that was built under a government scheme, and the kind of large infrastructure, toilet kind of infrastructure. But the caretaker who slowly settled the place, so every time we sort of visited him, you would see that at some point he sort of laid the floor, he had built the railing, got a rabbit over there in his place. At one point he got an air curtain and sort of placed it in this place, and it was kind of kept on a chair. The next time you went, it was, he had like legs that are installed to it. And so in some ways, the place was slowly growing, slowly settling. The next time we went, there was a landscape, a garden had started growing in front of it. And then there was at one point, a conference that he had set up with small time contractors of the locality, and it was a small seminar, that was going on. And at some point he pointed out, this person, one of the contractors pointed out to this blue house and said, I've just built this house, and, I built it in 5 days, but I've kind of managed to solve the ventilation problem by, creating the roof to kind of, get raised. And so in some ways, there is this idea that slowly settling happens. Again, this was another instance, the slum sanitation project, again, that was set up by the government, and it looks like a large infrastructure project, that perhaps is right for a self-built settlement. But in many ways, we were doing an evaluation and we saw that a lot of this infrastructure, the caretaker that you saw, took care of it, but in many cases, these didn't work, and these were large infrastructures that almost collapsed. And so you found that, there was this the municipal officials had actually gone and done something very different. They hadn't gone the route of building large, toilets, and those large toilets were built actually for a lot of money by, by NGOs and contractors who had come together, and actually the NGOs also made a lot of money in the process. But here you had the lower level municipal officials, who said these just don't work, these large infrastructures. So what they did is that they got the small contractors, like you saw before, to lay the infrastructure pipes inside in these settlements. And then, people built their own toilets inside their houses, whenever when they had the money to. And these were actually so much more dignified than the large, toilets sitting there, which looked like you had done a lot of work, but they just, were so undignified, because you would have to walk around with your pail and stand out there. Women actually for the longest time, would have to wait in line, wait till the men who had to go out for work sort of went away, So in some ways this, and then if you saw the place, it was a very, very, very kind of, it became a place which was clean. It was almost like a village settlement, and it was a nice place to be in, and again, so these are forms of settling. This was another one, which was a mosque, which had settled, and the shops, like the transactional spaces that we saw before, became financing devices for the mosque, and so in some ways the mosque was able to survive in this place. The shrine was able to survive because of these kind of occupancies around. So that was, that's the second term. The first one was transactional capacities. The second term is settling. And the third, again, an important term for us to kind of think of cities through, is that people have trips and kicks in the way they inhabit cities, and again, this is the caretaker who had a trip, who kind of, settled the place. You had the BMC workers who had a trip, who settled the place. This was in Lamington Road, where you had, somebody who was sort of collecting these little parts of computer parts that had, got outdated. And then you had, because people have older computers, and then, they keep getting outdated. So this person would, he was a collector, almost like a collector, go and find these old parts and keep them. And he had a BMC ward number and everything. His phone number was available. People would call him and say, I need so-and-so part. And so, and then there was this laptop repairing guy who was again located in one of the shops under the staircase. And the way he sort of advertised his own, in the city sort of became a sign for advertising where his shop is located. Or then this guy, the shirtless guy here, who is a landlord, and what he's rented out is just that wall. He's rented out the wall to the lottery guy, and he spends his entire time, because he gets a little bit of money, he spends his entire time, hanging around with the lottery guys there. Or then this one, who was again a trip, because again, he was a guy who had LED, who kind of, sold LED lights in Lamington Road. And he was fascinated by the, when the Chinese LED kind of goods came into the market, and his father was a tailor. He had taken over his father's shop. So he got his father to stitch him one of those Yarana suits, and he would walk around Lamington Road wearing those Yarana suits, And so in some ways, that's the way you kind of look at the fact that there are, the cities are enjoyed, that people enjoy cities, that they have idiosyncrasies through which they live cities. And this is the kind of last case of Pradeep, who occupied the space in again an inner city, and his shop was really kind of small. And what was happening is that that was the shop, and he was losing his business. And that's what he shows us, that the parts of the on the printed circuit board are becoming smaller and smaller. And he's a repair person. He's repairing these, and he finds that it's becoming more and more difficult to repair these parts. And so what he does is that he divides his shop into two parts and rents out a part to a warehouse, to somebody who kind of comes and keeps goods there. But then the rest of the time, he's, he repairs parts, but also spends a lot of time, watching over. So he's made this little device, which is like a surveillance device out of his bicycle rear view mirror. And he kind of watches people go in and out of the shop. He does this, he collects gods. But this was interesting because he has this little blackboard on his door, and he does a math for us, and he says that, this Marwadi gentleman who came, and he told him that this is the math, like if you retain the shop in Lamington Road, which is prime real estate, you're a fool because you're losing all this money. But he says, what else can I do? I enjoy being here, And so this idea of enjoyment somehow doesn't feature in the way we look at, the occupation of cities, because you're always looking at the utilitarian aspect of cities. And then he points out to us, this chair that he's kind of designing. It's the most ergonomic chair, with a lower back support. And then this kind of watch that he designs, which is a dial, which is contrasting dial so that he sees better. And these are pens that he's designing out of acrylic that is sort of lying around in his shop. And he says, again, why I do it, because when he goes to the bank, everyone is stealing pens from him. And so he makes this pen so that nobody knows it's a pen, and so he's kind of very meticulously bends this acrylic piece, puts a little, refill in it. There's also a spring that kind of operates the pen. And then, he shows a series of these iterations, which are, the brass and series. He's a designer, and he has a kick that he kind of occupies the space and, keeps sort of designing things through. And so that was, the third term that we were interested in the analysis of cities, and in kind of looking at this idea that cities can be seen through this idea of transactional capacities, the idea of settling, and the idea of trips and kicks. And so I'll just end with this last, a kind of small project that we did. We made this transactional space, but for us, what was interesting is that all these three, the idea of transactional spaces, the idea of settling, and the trips and kicks all came together in this. It was also in Mankurd, where you saw these buildings were being built with very, very less social infrastructure. It's almost like the government has forgotten that, you need social infrastructure when you put together something like that. And so we found that, these were all the people who were already beginning to settle the place, They were occupying the place, they were settling it. You could see that, two galas were being occupied, and, by a shrine sometimes, by a temple sometimes, and all kinds of ways in which people were occupying the space. And so they had already built this little shed in the vicinity, and they were using it for many things, but over time it had started getting dilapidated. So we said, why not, this was funds that we got from an art project, which was looking at the idea of the public realm. And we said, if the public realm, it doesn't exist over here, or it's difficult because of lack of infrastructure, then why don't we build the infrastructure to create a public realm, And so we kind of did this little insert in this, we retrofitted that kind of the dilapidated shed, build this, went through series of workshops of, how to build it, and build this little space, which is a library. And this was built with Sharif Bhai, who's a grill maker, and also works in Kurla, which is one of the largest recycling centers. So you find everything from ATM machines to, other things in that place. That's the workshop. And then we started putting together material from the recycling, industry of Kurla itself, the Tetra Pak roof, and series of sort of, materials from the place. And then, started sort of building, retrofitting it. And that's what it's kind of a place which is camouflaged from the outside, but has these kind of roofs that float above the space. And yeah, so that was the day of the opening. And then this kind of, series of places. There's a balcony above. There's a place that you can, turn around. You can sit and watch, be part of the library on one side, kind of sit and watch a film being screened on the other side. a ladder that can sort of move around the space and occupy the space in different ways. It's kind of mobile ladder, and that's one of the film screenings that are happening, so that you're sitting on the top and watching it below. And then yeah, there's a balwadi that that used to happen in the mornings, a toy library, and a kind of a library that was growing with crowdfunding. So it sort of began with that and then sort of grew to that, and then this kind of garden that grew in front of it. And I think that was, I'll end there, but in some ways that was, we could see that the place was settling, and then this idea was that again, it's one step, it's not sort of cleaned up, or it's not something that is impossible to do. You kind of work with small funds that you have, but you take it to another level, so that the idea of settling the transactional capacities and all the trips and kicks of people who are already sort of building the place came together to sort of, inhabit and sort of settle the place. And it's still settling, so that's where I would like to end. But yeah, so I think that, that was something that I wanted to bring to the table here, the three concepts through which we've been looking at cities, and we feel that it's, something that one can actually think about when one thinks about cities. So I'll stop sharing. Yeah, I'll just come back to this. Yeah.
Rupali, thank you so much for that. That's just a wonderful kind of a wonderful introduction to all that you've done. I know that it's a small part, but I want to concentrate on particularly that last project. If you can elaborate a little bit more on how that came about and the context in which it is, the Balwadi and the kind of activities and the relationship between you as quote unquote architects and the community, and the community with all the people, their trips and kicks, and how you went about it. If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah. So I think, one of the things is that, again, really sort of looking at not, the architect as a single figure, and I think that has something that has happened over the years. It's a lot of our own modernist training, that has in some ways looked at the figure of the architect as the individual, person who kind of, builds, starts from scratch, and gets a project. You have a client and you sort of, build, right? But in some ways, like I said, the architects of this place are many more. It's all of these people who have already started, settling the place, and what we're doing is kind of facilitating it, and in some ways the way funds come into the picture, the way you kind of settle the place, the funds came from somewhere else. There was the place is being maintained in different ways. So how do you actually kind of, the way cities settle and the way places settle are not linear, and I think that is something that is important for us to bring to the table, that cities have many agencies that operate, and our own logics of working with things so far have been, modernist. They have been, almost sort of thinking of tabula rasa situations, starting from scratch and building. But this is one of the arguments that we've been having for a long time, that, it's important to start thinking of ways in which you actually start looking at what already exists, and also retrofitting, retrofitting cities, because that is something that architects are not trained to do at all. You have this kind of grand vision that you begin with, but cities are made by many more people, and they've settled. They take time to settle when they are started from scratch. And all these cases that we're seeing, smart city propositions and many others, they're not cities. Cities happen when they settle and take time to settle and form relationships. So I think that's where we come from also, and the fact that it's not one architect, but there's series of people who are settling the place is what is important. And it's nudging, it's nudging, it's growing, and still growing. So yeah.
So Rupali, in this, let's say this new paradigm of practice, it occurred to me when you were speaking that you're almost talking about the urban condition as a kind of, the way that when you talk about settling and you talk about this engagement, which happens with a certain proximity and embodied engagement with the context, with the city itself. So, I mean, it occurred to me that it's very much like you would actually prepare yourself to deal with, let's say, an agricultural ground. I mean this in terms of gently nourishing it, stabilizing the earth, making it kind of fertile for it to take certain types of crops, allowing those crops to grow. I'm just saying that there's a kind of cyclical, time-related dimension to practice. It's not a one-time act, as we tend to look at a project that we are in and out. The project ends, and then we carry on, and the city carries on. I'd like you to just respond to this one-time act versus a recurrent kind of cycle of engagement.
It's a process, no? That's something that is important. Cities are not projects, they're processes, and they're sort of deep engagements. And I think that is important. And when architects contribute to cities, I think that's something that is important to think about, this idea of thinking of the idea of processes and not projects, So yeah, I mean, that's where like the whole metaphor of growing and settling kind of comes in.
Okay, I'll open up to the other panelists and ask them to please step in and join the conversation. And then we can go to some of the other questions which are coming up in the Q&A. But please, all of you who are on the panel, please come in and join.
Rupali, thanks a lot for that wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask you that in the context of those three subdivisions of the transactional objects, settling, and the trips and cakes, how would you redefine the understanding of a street? If you were to provide infrastructure and provide a street which holds that infrastructure in a context where you are, as a designer, how would you think about it differently? How would you think about connections differently?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's something, again, to kind of look at, that streets have been, seen only through the idea of either, I mean, they've been seen through the instrumental lens, through either looking at this idea of movement, and most of the times they are vehicular movements. But again, we see the way in which cities are occupied in many, many more ways, And so when you think of, again, the role of design, I think the role of design is to nudge, like it's to nudge, and which is why it's also important to look at what occupancies exist, what happens over there. And I think all you can do is nudge, because otherwise you're kind of, there's series of sort of balances that happen, series of ways in which occupancies happen, inhabitations happen, agencies happen. And I think you'll kind of take away a lot of those agencies and a lot of the occupancies that, that happen. So I think what you can do is nudge, and I think nudging is an important sort of role to be played by the designer.
Yeah, no, it also sort of intimates one with a scale of interaction which is quite different than what we've generally been, at least in the recent past, considering streets as completely efficient things, that transport as something which is efficient rather than nudging people around the city, or in that sense as smaller scale interventions coming together, almost in a jugaad sense of the city, like some of these, which has a sense of that transactional object in them somehow.
Yeah. I'm not very, I mean, I don't like the word jugaad very much, because, in some ways it takes away, it almost feels like it's the other, it's not, but it's, if you see the way people occupy spaces, then that's actually the mainstream, It's
I think, yeah, you're right. The moment you call it jugaad, it's almost, it is taken away from its context and seen as an object, rather than it being a part of a context where it's behaving to, or where it's connected to.
Yeah. Series of Q&As.
Sorry, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Again, I do this often. Rupali, I missed a little bit of your presentation, but I loved what I saw, and it was, and I've been telling Riaz that, the talks that we've been having have so kind of seamlessly fitted into the conversations we've been having parallelly in the studio. And then this seems completely exactly where we would have liked to have your talk. And it's accidentally happened that there's been a little delay of one day, and I can't tell you how timely it has been. But I also liked the fact that there was no modernist distance of the subject that you were studying from. There was an intimacy with which you have documented the whole thing. And I think that's also remarkable as well as valuable for all of us. I was just curious about because you've used terms very effectively, terms like nudging, trip and kick, but you've also used settling, occupying and inhabiting almost interchangeably. And this is something that some of the participants have kind of brought it up in the studio regarding, occupying is not a preferred word, maybe inhabiting is a preferred word and so on. And these kind of nuances seem to have, you've kind of bridged over that little thing. And the other thing that I was also thinking about, that how the aesthetic of Mumbai is so different from Delhi, even if one considers the old city of Delhi, that there is a certain aesthetic of the material of, tin sheets, of little parts, of old parts, and everything that can be carried through narrow streets and narrow lanes. Even that little plant that was planted in a drum, and the whole kind of inventive mechanism that is so, you can see it in Mumbai, but somehow in Delhi it's a little bit different. I'm sure it's there in its own way, but it's a little different, and that aesthetic is also very interesting for us to see and notice. So anyway, the question regarding the occupancy versus...
Yeah. So again, I mean, I think to also follow up a lot of ways in which cities have been also written about. So we have, there's Solomon Benjamin, who writes about this idea of occupancy urbanism, and he talks about series of tenures through which people occupy cities. And that has been very, very, useful in the whole critique of what is seen as the idea of ownership. Because what happens with ownership, and this is something particularly with India, we find that complex tenures exist, and there's a whole sort of planning discourse that has been pushing towards, the idea of actually, what they call tenure security. But what happens with that is often that it irons out many of these kind of relationships, and you find all kinds of, Riaz talked about, brought in agriculture, and you find that in West Bengal, you have the same land that is occupied by, the fisher folk at one point and the farmers at one point, because, water that gets collected on the field starts becoming, place where you also, kind of have fish in, or you find that even in the Northeast, you find these kind of practices. So this whole idea of multiple occupancies of the same land has actually facilitated so much more, and allowed people to kind of exist and, occupy land, versus what happens when you think of this idea of ownership, And so in that sense, we'll find this across, and particularly in India, you find these complex patterns of sort of inhabitation. And that's where I'm coming from discourses that have been written about in many ways, and that inhabitation then becomes, much more intimate, because it comes out of these kind of forms of, occupying land. So that's where I'm sort of, bringing in these terms which are not interchangeable, but work together.
Rupali, there are many questions from the attendees. What we're going to do is perhaps ask them to join the panel and ask you their questions themselves. I think then we get to see the people who are asking and engage with them. Viggy, are you doing that? Are you?
Yeah, I think Radhika.
I've already done that. So.
Okay.
Shivani, would you like to ask your question? Please, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hi, that was a great talk. I just want to know what the role of the architect is in a city that seems to be like designing things and settling by themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I think I just want to come back to the whole idea of the architect, as you know it, like I mean, if you historicize, the figure of the architect is not very old. I mean, sorry, not very new. It's a probably maximum 250-year-old profession, 300-year-old profession. Before that, you had many other ways in which you sort of occupied. So again, I'm coming back to this, the modernist idea of the architect, and how you sort of operate. And that when you ask that question, then you're thinking of only this very limited historicized figure of the architect, but if you extend that, and start looking at architecture and inhabitation as forms of life, then you become many more things, and you kind of also expand that role of the architect, who's not just that expert, but also is somebody who is an inhabitant of the city, and which is why I like to kind of look at the figure of the urbanist and the architect together, because then you're not only looking at, the kind of narrow disciplinary role of that professional, and that's when it kind of, which is why I'm saying it opens up so many more ways in which you can operate, because you are nudging things, you can be repairing, retrofitting, you can be a client who's bringing in money from somewhere else, and sort of building, facilitating something else. So your roles expand, I think, when you kind of expand the figure of the architect, the role of the architect kind of also expands when you redefine the idea of the architect.
Okay, thank you.
Radhika, would you like to ask your question?
Nice question. Radhika.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Rupali.
Hi.
Thank you for such a lovely presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
So I had two questions. One is, how would our cities have been if women had been designing them, because our concerns would have been different, like proximity of schools and shopping together, perhaps. And I mean, I was wondering what you thought.
Yeah.
And my second question was, how do you make cities safer for women? Because if once you make them safer for women, then I mean, they would be safe for everybody. So, so these were my two questions.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic question, and I think very relevant. And I think this is where the idea of nuances comes in, because then you're not building something which is generic, and often this is where a lot of our ideas of standards and our ideas of kind of working with broad brush statistics kind of also comes from, but if you start looking at nuances in the way cities operate, you will require, to think very, carefully about all kinds of ways in which people inhabit cities, and women, particularly also inhabit cities in very different ways. And so you would be, which is where this idea of the grain comes from, to be able to see a closer grain of cities is something that is important. And that's where, it becomes extremely important to think through the lens of women as well. That is one part of the answer. The other one is, I'll just also kind of give you an anecdote and very interesting. There was, in a village called Murbad, which is 2 kilometers from Mumbai, and it's a tribal village. And you'll see that, again, a lot of the ways in which the houses were built, they're built with wattle and daub and the traditional houses that were built. And women were very much part of that process of building, and they were the ones who actually built the walls, the wattle and daub walls, whereas men did the foundations and, the structural system and all. And women made the enclosures, they made the walls, they did the flooring and all of that. And then what happens again in this process where the government comes in, and this is, they give, under the Indira Awas Yojana, they give funds, but one of the caveats is that you should not build out of what is called the kacha material, So you cannot build what the traditional house is called the kacha house, So if you build in that material, you will not get funds. And so women have automatically got sort of wiped out of this process, because now you have a contractor, again, a kind of figure who's, part of the whole sort of world of, the modern world of building things. And then it's a profession. It's coming from this idea that, there's only men who are in the contracting business. And then the kind of house that gets built is also this absolutely generic house with, the idea of living rooms and bedrooms and all of that, which did not exist. But often you find that the people are not able to live in those kind of houses because they don't breathe, and so what a lot of people do is they kind of circumvent that policy. They get the money from the government, they'll build a little bit of the house, but then kind of make extensions to it that are porous, and they're built out of the material that they are used to. And that's when, and women have particularly been doing that. They've been sort of in the process of kind of coming back and circumventing these rules. And we've seen that in a lot in the way they kind of occupy space. And across, if you look at a lot of the self-built settlements, they're actually built by women, because they are the ones who are at the helm of affairs. The men are all drinking and I don't know what. they're with the resources. But it's the women who are building these cities. So I don't think that women do not have agency. I think it's important to see what are the places that women are building.
And especially in the villages, you see women, using their hands and, painting or creating textures and, doing so much to the house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Rupali.
Sure.
Mansi, would you like to come in with your question? Mansi?
Yeah, I'll just read out her question. I think she might have stepped away. Mansi says, very nice presentation, Rupali, but the question still remains how to reconcile the understanding that city is a process with the concept of it being an ambitious project for the decision makers of the city. I'm talking in reference to the smart cities, but I'm sure she's also talking in reference to the Central Vista project and so on.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I think the real sort of problem is that we are imagining these kind of, like the smart city, what is the smart city? I don't think anybody knows what a smart city is. Most of these kind of become things that are, in campaigns and propagandas and all of that. And they do not exist, like if you really kind of look at this idea, if you want to make a city smart, then you will start, working with what exists, what is already smart about the city, and sort of, nudging it, pushing it, making it smarter. Right? I think that's where you will operate from. And same with Central Vista, like why do you really have to make, I think enough has been said about it. Why do you really require that kind of infrastructure? Does the parliament even work like that? Do you really require that many buildings? Is it possible to work with what exists and retrofit it and, kind of make it part of the city? Look at how cities are already inhabited and take that, further, instead of starting from scratch and making these kind of projects which are, legacies for our politicians. So I think all of these are, all the terms themselves, the smart city and all of that are deeply problematic in the first place. You don't build cities like that.
Rupali, I want to ask you that, one of the things is that you seem to have dismantled the category that architects are to operate with. And I mean this in terms of the word building. It seems that we are no longer to consider the building as an important, a thing, and that the things that we try to do are much smaller and much, I don't, actually, it's not a question of small.
Yeah.
It's not a question of small, but it is a question of the kind of engagement and the number of people and agencies that we engage with in order to do something. I want to ask you about two dimensions of this. One is that everything becomes an object because it is something that is collectively made whole. And what I mean by that is that the sense of space, as we were as architects conditioned to kind of aspire for, but aspire for in a sense of coherence. I'm saying, so the question is that what allows us to talk about coherence when there are so many actors in the process of making, and what is your understanding of the sensibility of this coherence? Does it require us to recondition what we look at as coherent? Because clearly right now, a line drawn by a single man across a large geography is what gives coherence to a landscape or an urban scape. But now we are talking about several small actors constantly in negotiation and in transaction, incrementally building, a word which I like, but incrementally building with resources that come in. How does, towards what is one building apart from the immediate need? Is there a possibility of aspiration? Where does that come in? Where do social dimensions of that come in your understanding?
So, okay. So two parts to that answer, I think. One is that I don't think building is negated, I'm just saying that somewhere down the line, it can come up, like if that's a requirement, if that's something that you would require the kind of process to turn into. And we are seeing a lot of these cases, like, for example, old cooperative societies kind of coming together. Historically, we've had these conditions where people have come together and built their own housing through cooperative societies rather than developers, and architects have been sort of part of the process. So I'm not saying that, building is completely out, and the building is also part of the settling, like it's part of the settling process itself. So there is the possibility of a building in this process, also in the process of city making. Yeah, that is one. But the second is that I think our vocabularies as architects, with people have to start I think often when we fight or we kind of talk about projects, it's through things, through terms that are not spatial, and in some ways I think it's important as that one, that you as architects, kind of, when you're saying this idea of coherence and the idea of space making, that's something that needs to come together in a conversation, which is with many more people, so it doesn't remain jargon but becomes mainstream discussion. What is it that kind of creates, and these are things that create spatial justice, the setting of certain configurations. And I'll just give you the example of, say, that the porous house, the porous house was configured in a particular way, and it created a form of social justice because it was porous. It kind of combined itself with, the corridors on both sides. So the home was really not just that house, but it was all those spaces around, right? Now that needs to be brought into conversation with many more people. So the languages that we use, for coherence and spatial thinking have to be brought into the mainstream, to talk about things like spatial justice. It's not social justice, it's spatial justice, which is leading to social justice, right? But often what happens is when we wear the sociologist hat, we do not use spatial terms, we do not bring them into mainstream discourse. And I think that is important, because otherwise, the architects are also, which is why architects are getting marginalized, in some ways. Either you are, working, you speak the jargon, and to yourself, or then you kind of use words that are not bringing in ideas of spatialities. So is it possible to sort of work in a terrain where you are able to bridge these two spaces? And I think that's very, very important for architects to work with.
So in that context, what do you feel about languages and having to communicate in your native language? Because personally, I have felt it even with my own family, when we talk architecture, and especially when it gets to that point where you're really trying to communicate around space, you by default have to switch to English, and that becomes, I found a lot of times it becomes a kind of a big split between what you're trying to convey. And
yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I think you have to kind of start thinking of various vocabularies through which you kind of expand this. I mean, it's a conversation, and it's not, so the conversation has to kind of get thicker and deeper. And when we were doing that exhibition, we curated this exhibition called Venice Space at the Jawahar Kala Kendra, and Riyaz was part of that. His work was part of that also. We did a translation in Hindi, and there's series of spent a lot of time thinking of what space is, and but what was interesting in the conversation, and the translator was a friend, the conversations were so rich, because the things that came to us, the kind of the discourse that sort of came to us was not only translation, but it was one step, like I would say with the transactional object, it was one step up, So it kind of also brought in, it folded in many, many conceptual terms that actually opened up our own languages. So you're right. I mean, it has to start becoming richer in terms of, involving many more languages, but many more, philosophical traditions of thinking of space.
And what do you think is the role of education in that?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. There, role of education is to really kind of build that language, that discourse, because I totally believe that a lot of our own, pedagogical processes come from modernist ways of doing things, and it's really, but we have opened to us so many more, dimensions of lived, I mean, we have these experiences around us, we're surrounded by them. And so it's really important for us to kind of shift our own, our own discourses, our theoretical sort of engagements, our practices, our modes of working. A lot of them needs to shift, and it has to, I mean, it has to be in the pedagogical space as well as in the space of practice.
So one thought I had was, because the spaces that you have shown in the images are perhaps spaces which kind of are able to go outside the bounds of statutory norms or bylaws. And is subversion even a word that comes to the minds of people who occupy such spaces? Or is it something so so immediate that it's, I mean, they're not even thinking that it's a subversive activity?
I'll give you two answers to that. One is that, I mean, if you look at some of those, I showed you some of those houses that was, the resettlement colonies in Mankurt. Those were made with perfectly, they were perfectly legal. They were made with all the bylaws in place, but they were the most horrendous places, and in some ways, they were, I mean, they are completely against all forms of, social justice, spatial justice, all of that, right? And that's where, I mean, a lot of the bylaws are leading to, right? And I mean, that's again something, thinking of what the architect is taught. The architect is taught to work with ethics, which come with these boundaries, And again, a lot of this comes from our modernist ways of kind of looking at cities, and looking at professions and practices and all of that. But what makes, and which is why we call them self-built settlements and not, slums or anything else, because it's the plan that makes them illegal, whereas they're doing all kinds of things. They're producing legitimate things which you and I consume, and, all of that. So this whole idea of what is, how do you kind of look at this idea of, legality, illegality, and all, there's a discourse to that.
So my question was, in their minds, was this an act of subversion, or was this something that they were? No. So yeah.
Not, I don't think it's a form of subversion, because when moment you think of subversion, there is something that you're subverting, no? I mean, these are forms of life and occupation, and and like the moral, the kind of the codes are kind of part of one world.
Yeah. But when somebody reappropriated the toilet, for example, was that something that into their minds, and were they doing it slowly to kind of not get noticed?
No, so that, sorry, go ahead.
Could they have done it all at once if they had the means?
No, so that particular, I don't know which one, the one that I showed you, both the cases that I showed you, both came out of a government project actually, so it was not only people doing it for themselves. So the first one was under a slum sanitation project that was set up by the municipal government, but also with the World Bank funding, and there were series of things that are there. One is that you build these infrastructures. There was one of the things that you had to have an NGO and a contractor pair that came together to build this, and a lot of NGOs and contractors came together because it was also a lot of money, it was a project, right? And so they built it. But one of the things in that was also that you had to have a community-based organization that set up this place, a CVO. And the NGO had to train the CVO to kind of maintain the toilet. In most cases, it didn't happen because it takes, again, it takes a lot of effort to settle, and NGOs, have traditionally have come from the grassroots and have done that. But today have also got into the project mode, So most cases it didn't work. The CVOs did not maintain, were not trained. These places were not maintained. Also, like for all the reasons that I told you, a lot of times these were, places, these are not kind of dignifying places, and you require a community to maintain it and all of that. So it didn't happen in many cases. In the case where, the first case I showed you, that's when the caretaker was living there, and it was his trip and kick, and he sort of, maintained it and took care of it and set up a whole sort of, infrastructure around it. In the second case, it was actually the lower level BMC staff, who are often called, corrupt and all kinds of things, at the kind of lower level bureaucracy. They were the ones who actually went ahead and who had actually no stakes in it, who were not making money like the contractors and the NGOs were making, but they had the ground presence. They knew the contractors around, and they knew the kind of the people from the self-built settlement, and they actually worked with them to say, what we'll do is we'll put in the money, BMC money, to put infrastructure under the roads, and take those infrastructures to the houses. People have been doing this all the time. They've been renovating their houses. They've been putting in their own money into, into improving their own houses anyways. And so they did it themselves. They built the toilets inside once that infrastructure was laid. Yeah. So people have capacities and people have agencies, and that's something that we do not consider, So that's again something that one really, which is why this whole idea of repairing and retrofitting, I think, is a very important thing to kind of dignify spaces. And I'll just give you one small statistic, in the figure of, in the kind of thing of housing in Mumbai. The thing is that in the last 20 years, with all the policies that exist now, all the policies, we've been only able to build a fraction of the demand. Like if you kind of look at the demand that exists, and if you project that further, for the present demand, it will take 100 years to complete this present demand. So it's as absurd as that, So the thing is, we always think of starting from scratch, and we say that, you require new housing and, all of that. But if you take up repair and retrofitting as something serious, then you will be able to dignify spaces. And it's not that people do not already have houses. Again, the whole definition of the home needs to change. You start looking at the idea of the city as a home, the neighborhood as a home. Yeah, and that's where the government puts in money and infrastructure and all of that. The whole idea of the privatized idea of the dwelling as a space inside is a thing that is made by the developers today. You know, our definitions of home were much larger than that.
Sahana, would you like to come in and ask your question, please?
Hey, good evening. I really loved the presentation. It was quite interesting. All the little bit. I think these are the things that I miss being in a city, where sometimes I feel these small settlements that you get to see such innovative things that are getting carried on as an adaptive sort of a measure in the city. So my question was sort of the way these settlements happen. It's very interesting to see it happen, and it's something that people like to learn and adapt to. But to what degree do we sort of encourage this when we look at the carrying capacity of a city?
So again, I mean, I think the graph, I think somebody was also asking him the question about the graph. Actually, the carrying capacity of cities is much more compromised in many of the other redevelopment projects. You know, if you see what happens, because they come out of general statistics and general, bylaws. For example, an inner city, which is completely walkable, you know, when it's building, it's the only imagination is to build apartments, you know, and then the rule is that for every apartment, you have to have a car. So inner cities are completely destroyed because you have up to ground and 7 stories parking, you know, and then you have the apartments, you know, as towers sort of above that, right? And so it's completely compromising all forms of carrying capacity, because what happens is that, I mean, you can imagine what will happen when all those cars start coming down, you know, and roads that are made for so many more things, for, you know, all forms of occupancy, for walking, and, you know, all of those things we've been seeing before, is something that we do not take into consideration, you know. So carrying capacities are actually much more compromised in other cases. These cases, the cases that I'm talking about, actually occupy a very little space, you know, and set up a form of life and living with very little resources, but are also able to set up a form of life and living which, you know, which actually gives back to the city in many ways, you know. So which is why I'm saying that we, instead of thinking of, you know, terms like carrying capacities and all of that, because then what you do is again scratch, you know, you say you have big roads, you know, you already have thought of redevelopment, which is default, and now you need big roads. So you start widening roads, and then you start destroying city space through a certain vocabulary that we build, you know. But instead, if you change the ways you start looking at cities, if you start looking at the idea of the city as home, neighborhood as home, you know, the idea of lived spaces, you will see things very differently. You will actually build that carrying capacity, but the carrying capacity will not probably be for vehicles, you know. The carrying capacity will be to occupy life, you know, for life to inhabit itself.
Thank you for that.
Sukmani, you have a question. Will you switch on your video?
Yeah, hi. My question is, these categories of transaction, settling, and tricks and kicks that you view the city through, can you look at rural habitats with these categories, or are these specific to cities? The larger question is really, do cities encourage these kind of, you know, ways of inhabiting it through transaction, settling, and kicks and tricks? And what happens when you move towards a more rural habitat?
Yeah. So again, 2 things. One is, you know, today we really do not have such a distinction between the urban and the rural, you know, urban condition. And this is something that Lefebvre has said also many years ago, the idea that the urban is seen as conditions, you know, and these urban conditions emerge in many places. So with all forms of, you know, transactions that happen across, you know, between the rural and the urban, these categories of rural and urban have started collapsing, you know. But also, I mean, I gave you the example of this tribal village in, you know, in Murbad, which is, you know, 2 hours from Mumbai. And that's again a place where a tribal woman was, with her trip and a kick was, in some ways circumventing these bizarre government policies and, taking that money, but also sort of, renovating her own house, retrofitting her own house, where she extends, into the backyard of that house and actually kind of makes herself a kitchen over there, and that kitchen is not a modern kitchen, because the old kitchen that a contractor had built for her was a tiny room, one of the generic sort of kitchens that get built with a platform and all of that, but she couldn't breathe in there. It was impossible so what she did was she kind of created an extension. She made a whole veranda, out of her own wattle and daub and all of that, and which became an extension to her house, but it was a kitchen which was a veranda, So in some ways, I don't think that the idea of trips and kicks and settling is something that is limited to cities anymore. One, because the categories of looking at the idea of urban and rural have collapsed. There are, they sort of, there are practices that kind of go between them. But you'll find that these are, ways in which people live their life. These are forms of life and living.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Radhika, are there any other questions?
Yeah, I think Arun wanted to ask something, so I'm just bringing him in. Arun, yeah, if you can unmute yourself, please. Yeah. Arun, can you ask?
Hi. Yeah. So, Rupali, absolutely wonderful presentation, and I think the degree of sensitivity and observation towards the manipulation of making the environment your own, and the range of those you showed were just fascinating. Also love the stuff you produced. When I was doing my thesis, so one thing that I'd come across was the notion that that prior to the British times, the Mughal taxed the agricultural land, and the urban settlement was not a source of revenue collection. So if you look at the pre-British, revenue maps, you will see that the land parcels outside the city are mapped. And the city itself is a black hole. So what that was that, the city and its habitation allowed that flexibility because the land parcel was not fixed. You were not being taxed on it. So it became a much more transactional relationship. And I think what the British sought to do was to collect revenue from residential property in the process. So this is the historic reason why there will never be medieval settlements again. Because in the process, they divided each property as it existed at that point in time, and thereby freezing it. Yeah. And they also created this commons, the street. So the street then became the space which the government had to maintain because they were taxing the residential properties which were abutting on it. That goes to the heart of the reason why we Indians throw all this stuff on the street and keep the house clean, because if they're charging for it, then the government might as well clean it. It's not mine anymore. And so that, that whole inversion. And then of course, this is, the whole modern city itself is a whole abstraction, in which it creates a system. It's a global system which creates this infrastructure. And, it allows this modern settlement to sort of go across the globe and provide this common ground. And then, so this idea now that where is the flexible personal domain, and what is that, that system, that grid, if you want to just, call it the American grid in a way, is an infrastructure that allows movement, that allows, utilities and connections to be made. And then there is those areas in which people will, make spaces their own. So this distinction now is there to stay. I mean, it's there to stay everywhere. And so that's the notion of the city that we, inherit, and that it is going to be, unless, some very big fundamental change in the way we husband our environment comes about. It's for many years there to stay. And so the case of Mumbai, of course, is fascinating because of the amount of demands that is placed on it, so that all of that personal space then goes and starts to encroach back onto that public commons. And so that creates up a whole, sets up a whole different dialectic there. I mean, that's a world by itself. I don't think it even exists on this earth. What the people of Bombay have been able to do, in which they take charge back out of the sheer pressure of the tightness of the space, and take the ownership back. And I think that documentation that you have shown, absolutely fascinating. So I saw a range of questions coming around this topic, and I thought just a little bit of historical background here as to where this comes from might help in clarifying the discussion. But,
yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that. In fact, I mean, I'll come back to Bombay, but it also kind of reminds you of the Kowloon city in Hong Kong, for example, right? I don't know if you've seen that. It kind of came into in a place which was not regulated, and so in some ways the colonial government had actually sort of skipped that part and sort of created this, amazing, fantastic city sort of in the middle of it. But coming back to Bombay, you're absolutely right about the fact that the city has come about because of certain ways in which tax collection happened, and it's not possible to have this anymore, and which is all the more reason why we kind of have to look at these more carefully, because if you see what is happening now with subsequent redevelopment policies, we have things like cluster developments. So when you have an inner city, so the developers are given incentives to actually amalgamate lands. They have to come and amalgamate lands, and in return they will get more and more building rights, what we call FSI in Bombay, and other parts of the world it's called FAR. The developers are given more incentive rights if you are able to amalgamate. And so the kind of urban form that has come out of the historical sort of practices is kind of also flattening, because now what you're doing is you're amalgamating land, and then you will do that, come back and put the classic grid over it, because that's the only thing that we know of today, right? So I think that's where, again, this idea of how you redevelop and, where we're leading to, what we already have, and how do we actually, in some ways value what you have already, and the urban form, the specificities of the urban form that has evolved out of it, I think is important to speak about.
Absolutely. I think I totally agree with you, and thanks for that.
But Rupali, I just want to bring in another dimension of what Arun is saying, is that on one hand we feel that that this particular, say, techno-legal approach to building cities has completely overtaken us, and yet in some sense the world average, if I remember this, but certainly for the subcontinent, is that for the subcontinent I think it's 2.5% of all space is built by architects and is built within the framework that we talk about it. And I think the global is something like 4%. And yet we look at it as an incredible threat precisely because of what, the examples of redevelopment that you saw. I'm curious that I find it ironic that we have the practices are still alive worldwide of self-building. We also valorize in many ways self-built environments. I mean, whether we teach old cities or tourism paints a very romantic picture of them. I just wanted to know your thoughts on this, and whether that that line between planned and self-built environments is something that is a threat.
I think it's, again, really sort of important to look at the specificities of what they have produced, what the planned environments are producing and where they're coming from, and the self-built and what they're producing and where they've come from, and that's where this idea of really sort of talking through the vocabulary of typologies, of spaces and what they produce, I think those are important, and I think that is, it's not planned or unplanned, but what are some of the spaces that you're producing and are getting produced, and what are the ways in which, so for example, if you have a cooperative housing society that is being redeveloped today and you're an architect for that, then how would you actually, speak to them? What are the ways in which you kind of, bring in the vocabularies of type, typology, and sort of working out of form and urban form? And I think those are important conversations to have. So I don't see it between planned and self-built, but what is it that it is producing that I think is important?
I saw earlier this whole denigration of the smart city. And all it is really is our ability to use technology to make communication easier. And I would posit here that the extra eyes and ears and our ability to see, all parts of the city and to have the information flow will take away those blind spots behind which vested interests can hide. So it's a tool. Technology is always just a tool. And I totally disagree with this whole, whenever this discussion comes about demonizing modern technology, I will disagree. I think it's up to us how we use it. So for example, I will just give you an idea. All right, put a sensor on Yamuna and put the board right in the middle of Delhi, it should read what the particle count is. Put the sensor where the discharge of the industrial this thing is, and put the name of the industry and have it in the center of the city where all it is. I tell you, you start to do these things. Talk about even Mumbai and whatever is that you're trying to moderate over there. I'll tell you, those sensors, those active sensors, and this question of, we're using this in IoT within industries to streamline things, to use less energy, to create a more intelligent and responsive production process. But it's the same idea. You can take that idea of sensors and use it for our own good. It's just technology. The technology was more physical. It was allowing us to go from place to place, actually produce physical things. Now technology is more information. And how we use it, how we use this tool to empower us is up to us. And all of this, hegemonies that there is for, about big industry, about big landlords, big developers, doing things, all of this can be counteracted by just these tools. So, I mean, don't let smart city term turn you off.
It's not, no, it's not the term, but it's what goes under it. Absolutely agree. As long as it is, and what you're saying is really sort of retrofitting older cities, with smarter technology.
Absolutely.
So if I have a bus service that is, working on it, and I don't have to then build so many parking spaces, and I kind of improve the bus transport system and other things with technology, fantastic. And that's exactly what we've been talking about, this idea of retrofitting cities, right? But,
absolutely. Exactly. So Rupali, I actually saw that it was very sympathetic to what you were doing. For you, the next step would be to leverage those technologies and put the power of the people who are using those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only what smart cities then get, fall into, that is, the extensions of them, that they become places where you take up agricultural land, you kind of build new cities, and all of those.
Smart city is just about information, interlinking of the information, getting it to where it's being read, and connections being made. That is the only idea of the smart city. It is not a physical infrastructure. It is actually saying how the information can be collated, how it can be analyzed better, and how it can be put to use to better manage the resources we have in a very democratic way. So don't let this be, taken over by vested interests. It's not, if governments are making these announcements as they're saying we are going to do this, that's not the only way it can be used. It can be, we all have computers, we are all on the network. It is so easy to put these apps and to actually start to utilize this for our own purposes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Arun, at the beginning of the studio, you would have had many people agreeing with you. And I feel that, and of course, this is a conversation for another time. but I think now you will have at least 40 people disagreeing with you. All the
I'll
participants of this. No, simply because
I think all explorations are good. All explorations are good. And sometimes to make certain explorations, you have to, box away and keep certain concerns away. And for the purposes of this, if you say, let's not deal with technology right now.
No, it's not about it. No, there's no problem. There is no problem with technology and the use of a tool with technology. But just the example that you gave of putting a sensor in the Yamuna to kind of gauge the particulate matter of the Yamuna. I think that one of the reasons why the problem of the Yamuna has happened is because of a certain detachment that the people of the city have had with that river. And I think that that detachment has happened over a period of time, and it's because of industrial processes that detachment has happened in the first place, because of a certain technological. Hang on a second. I think there is a need for understanding sanctity, and if you kind of devalue sanctity in terms of a measurement of particulate matter.
I think it's a tool. It's a tool. It's like in the sense that you will use a car to go from A to B. And I say that as actually we become more and more sensitive towards the environment, and you will respect more, and you'll give more space to the pedestrian, and you will use it only when you use it. That does not make the tool bad. So
no,
I think
it just detaches you. It just detaches. As I said, it was another.
It's a balance.
It's a conversation for another time.
Yes, many things to add to that.
Gayatri has
if I
one
may,
and before we close out.
Yeah. Hi, Rupali. I have a question that it's completely veering away from what we've been talking about. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I felt that you were talking about many real serious processes in the city, and the way you were talking about it, everything that you were saying, the trips, the cakes, the settling, the transaction, those furniture commons, even those little objects that you had made for the Biennale, had this sense of playfulness in them. It's the way in which you engage with these serious processes. And is that something that you actively think about in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because, like I was also giving you some of these examples in cities itself, that's the energetic, self and practices is what has always made cities. And that's when I showed you the example of Pradeep, who's making those pens, and, he's kind of divided his shop, and the guy who sort of walked around with a light suit, and, and it's really sort of idiosyncrasies of people that have made, what cities are, and somehow we lose that playfulness, when in the instrumentalized kind of ways of looking at cities, we lose that kind of energy. We lose the energetic self that makes cities. And I think it's really important to think of that, because that's really what I really think that's what makes cities. And we're not trained as architects when we kind of work. It's always, to solve problems. But, cities are much more than problems. They're life.
I also have something to say. I'm sorry, it's not exactly a question, but you mentioned Lefebvre, and he's like one of my favorite authors. And Lefebvre and Soja, they are probably the most important spatial authors that have been neglected throughout history. And I would even include that bald philosopher, I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you, whether do you teach this in your college? Do you engage with Lefebvre and Soja and these spatial philosophy that they talk about?
Yeah, in many ways, at many levels. So they'll come in as smaller excerpts in studios, they'll come in as, in courses, and yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing that is important, I mean, even in sort of pedagogy, to look at this idea of, where things come from, and how do we look at philosophical, traditions, because otherwise what you take is a given, no? Like what are our epistemes? What are our structures of knowledge? I think are really important to think about, because otherwise a lot of what we know of seems to be the given, no? But they're all structures of knowledge. So how do we actually sort of, build on structures of knowledge? I think you have to deal with, philosophers, theorists who have spoken to, about it and engage with them. And I think it's important and it's also important to bring these down to sort of, really thinking of lived experiences with.
I agree. Because our education is, well, it has saturated quite a lot, but yeah. Well, anyway, thanks. Really loved it.
Rupali, you're going to get 5 students every year from OAS alone now.
And some funds from the Lefebvre Foundation.
So, on that note about city and life, it ties up with so many things that we've been discussing, but at a completely different scale. Rupali, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and the intimacy for the city that you shared. And I think this sense that you shared with us of how, and now it seems like a lost art of engaging with the city and sides of the city that, we would, that we at one point took for granted, that you would enjoy the mechanic on the side of the street. I certainly do, but that's another story. But I'm just saying the different people who make the city and their practices that make the city, and then our practices that make the city, and that we call them hobbies or profession or life or domesticity, and all these categories cut up that city into different domains. But if we are really living in that environment, the city is a playground, is in all those, is an agricultural field, is so many other imaginations that it can be. And thank you for opening this up for us. I think it's a very important dimension for our studio. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. It was a wonderful conversation. So thanks so much to all the panelists, and thanks so much to the participants.
Thank you, Rupali.
Thanks, Rupali.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.